So I will, if you like, put the agenda on the screen. Maybe that will help you. Are you able to see the screen now with the agenda?
No, the agenda was up and we took it down.
Oh my goodness. I hate GoToWebinar. I had no idea that you were looking at my screen the whole time. All right.
Okay. Should I kick us
Yep.
off?
Yes, please do.
Okay, you might have to remind me to say, oh, here, pursuant to this, just read this section, pursuant to chapter 22.
Yep.
Okay, pursuant to chapter 22 of the Acts of 2022, this meeting of the Somerville Community Preservation Committee will be conducted via remote participation. We will have a video recording available upon request as soon as possible after the meeting.
Okay. And then the first item that we have on the agenda is to invite John Hecker, the architect, working with the Somerville Hispanic Association for Community Development to answer committee questions since he wasn't able to be with us last month for the Q&A session. So I would invite committee members to bring any questions for John. We already saw last week, and I can bring back up the presentation that he shared with us via my reading of his documents last week. Are there questions about the phasing, the plan for what is to be completed in this round of funding request?
Maybe the arrangement of the priorities, because I think maybe that might have been a question of why I chose those priorities, because it was, I should see if there are any questions first before I jump into it. But if that is a question, I can.
That is
Rose, please.
Rose. That would be great. The hearing about the priorities, how you selected the priorities would be great. I think also just sort of a general, if you could talk about project management and not just kind of give us a sense of who is there sort of managing the project on a day-to-day basis. That's you.
This is, yeah, the buck stops with me. I'm an architect with the Spencer Preservation Group, and so we do the communication with you. We write the grant for Salvador and Lourdes. They're the owners or part of the corporate structure of the organization, but we help them with the whole process. And so then we give them the technical expertise and the I would say we're the intermediary with you and try and communicate to them what your needs are. And then we deal with our engineers and consultants as necessary on different technical aspects of the project. And we also try and educate them on the process and how they need to work with you. And they can't unilaterally do work on the building without consulting with Roberta or talk to me, then I talk to Roberta and say, this is something they're thinking about, and we try and keep them on track so we don't have too many surprises, because they're not really used to working with and the language can be difficult sometimes as well. But I'm the one who's kind of responsible, for good or worse sometimes, in terms of, I deal with the contractor, we select the contractor, we select the consultants. And so we try and also select the agenda and do the priorities. So on the priorities, the funding has varied. it has varied significantly. Like in fiscal year 21, it was $49,500, and then other years it's been $500,000. It's been remarkable. So the way I had these 6 priorities arranged, I was kind of making it like a cafeteria plan. I had some smaller items and some larger items, and I was focusing on sort of weather protection, finishing off gutters and downspouts and things like that. But if push came to shove, if there was a fair amount of money available, I would probably jump to priorities 3 and 4, since we're providing accessibility in terms of site accessibility and accessibility into the building. It would be really logical to follow that up with an elevator and a hoistway and provide access to all 3 floors, and to also provide accessible restrooms. It would help the client that the association serves, the clientele that they serve, to have the different to have access to the different services on the 3rd and the 2nd floor basement. The basement has the food pantry. So in a way, it would be obvious to carry that forward and just proceed with the accessibility, and some of the window work or some of the fussy preservation work could probably wait. But that's probably, I think that's probably $500,000. And so when I look at our cost estimate, I think for 4A and 3A, the new accessible elevator, that was $300,000, and the accessible restrooms were $60,000. But I would probably go, if the money were available in that number, I would go to those 2 items, 3A and 4A. But if you were trying to build things with a smaller budget, that's kind of how I arranged it, to put new gutters and downspouts on, a canopy over the entry area, and restoration of the remaining windows in the tower. And then if more money was available, rebuild the stair at the north elevation, things that are smaller amounts of money. I think the first and second priorities were, first priority was $140,000 total. Second one was $215,000. But if more money were available, I would say, let's try and finish off accessibility, because then for the owners of the building, it would allow them to get tenants maybe who would maybe pay more money, who would stay longer, who really need an elevator. And actually the daycare center on the 2nd floor could really use an elevator as well. But there might be funding available for them to apply for if the building were fully accessible. And currently it is not. And even after we're done with the fiscal year 21 and fiscal 22 work, which should start in the late winter, spring of 2023, it's still not going to have accessibility to the upper floors. So to make a long story shorter here, sorry, I'm kind of blabbing here, but 3A and 4A would make a lot of sense if there were a more substantial amount of money available. If it's a smaller amount, then I would probably go in the order that I have there. Is that a reasonable? Does that make sense?
Heather, are you able to speak now? No,
No.
we don't hear you. Dick, did you have a question?
You had mentioned the daycare center. I had been under the impression that they were no longer there. Am I incorrect about that?
It's a different daycare center. The earlier one was on the 1st floor, and the new one is on the 2nd floor. It's run by an organization called Catcher.
Okay, I didn't think of them as a daycare center, but okay. So I knew that Kesher was there. I thought that the daycare center had moved out, and when you said daycare center,
Yes, the earlier one has moved out. They moved out diagonally across the street to the commercial block, diagonally across. And so I believe the next one, maybe it's more accurate to call it a childcare facility, something like that.
got another question related to that. I don't know much about Kesher, but I do know I work kind of regularly with different funding programs for childcare centers, for licensed childcare centers. Do you know this is a licensed center? Is that right? Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
correct. They have
So do
regular
you know
inspections.
if you have they talked about or have they explored getting funding through the state's early education and out of school time program, the EEOST funds?
I don't know. Could you give me the acronym again? I'll
Yeah,
write it down.
it's early education and out of school time, EEOST, and it's a program that's run administered by the Children's Investment Fund, and they live under the umbrella of an organization that's called CEDAC. It's the Community Economic Development Assistance Corporation. So CEDAC.org.
Yeah, it's a lot to copy down. Could you maybe send me an email on
Yeah,
that?
I'm happy to.
You can send me an email and I'll forward it.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I just bring it up because I think that there's some really good resources out there that would be kind of a bigger. There's the possibility that they could be a good match for the daycare center. I think depending on the program. But so I guess that's backing up for a second. Have you guys explored other options for funding?
We did at Roberta's recommendation, we did an application to the Cummings Foundation, but we didn't survive the first cut. So we made an attempt at that, and I thought Roberta's recommendation was terrific. That seems like it seemed like a really good foundation to approach, but they told us that they had some ridiculous amount of applications. It was just crazy. So super competitive.
It is, yeah.
But we do have those materials.
I'm also looking into whether the city could consider ARPA funding for the project as well, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what the timeline is for having an answer on that.
I remember when they had the family shelter on the second floor, people from the housing department of Somerville came over because since it involved housing, there might have been some grants available, especially for the elevator to be put into the building. But now with housing out, that probably isn't something to consider.
Yeah.
But any ideas, I think they'd be open to any ideas. It'd be very helpful to know what some other opportunities might be to help share funding to improve the building.
I wonder, it's obvious if you didn't get funding to put the elevator in, you'd have an inaccessible building, but I'm wondering if the CPC were to reorder, like put 3 as number 1, as you're kind of encouraging us to do, what the repercussions were, would there be any with deprioritizing what you have as 1 and 2 here?
No, I don't think so. No,
okay.
I was just thinking that if it was a small fund of money available for fiscal year 23, then
I did get
that's why
input from, I'm sorry, I shouldn't interrupt you.
That's okay. I've talked too much already.
I got input from our planning staff at OSPCT who suggested that the weatherization are the highest priority at the moment because those are going to prevent further damage to the building. So those are a couple of the items in phase 1, the gutters and the restoring the windows on the 2nd and 3rd floor are probably urgent priority in terms of maintaining and stabilizing the condition of the building. And then after that, I think as John said, the prioritization, you could think instead about functionality rather than it sounded though as though you ordered it in terms of cost.
I did that, but I would agree with your
Yeah.
comment about the gutters and downspouts. That's helping to move water away from the building and collect it and not have it leak down the side. We've got some issues with brick masonry, spandrel panels, and cutting and repointing at the dental courses. They'll be taken care of in the fiscal year 21 work. But yeah, I would agree with what you just said, Roberta. The gutters and downspouts are important, and some of those windows in the tower to make sure they're weather tight. That's valid too.
So John, the inference I take about from what you said about 3A and 4A is if there were money, that would be at the top of the list. But if there's not enough money to do them, it isn't a priority to sort of have to do them because then there's no benefit from that. And am I understanding that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if the elevator and the hoistway could go in, that would make a lot of sense, and maybe save the accessible restrooms for a future program. So the 3A item, elevators are about 150,000, and it's hard to estimate the hoistway and the cutting and reinforcement of the structural of the openings that we'd have to make in the floors. But I think the 300,000 plus the fees to put the elevator and the hoistway in would be a big deal to get that done. And then the 4A, the accessible restrooms, could happen at a later date.
Heather, I just wanted to let you know, I don't know if you got my message. Heather would like to know about. So Heather, I don't know if you got my message that I have, I emailed you instructions for dialing in by phone. But what Heather wanted to ask was for you to give us the status on the previous grants. You did email me a description, which I printed and put into your meeting packets today. So committee members have that email in detail, but John, perhaps you could just give us the overview.
So it gets a little complicated in terms of how things have been repackaged. The fiscal year 21 work was a smaller grant amount of $49,500, and that was added on as a change order item to the fiscal year 20 work. And part of that work has been completed, but with I think between COVID and trying to get building permits and contractors being so backed up, and there's a major labor shortage for contractors, it's just been difficult to try and move it forward. So what we're hoping to do with the contractor Synaxo is that he's gonna fuse the fiscal year 21 work with the fiscal year 22 work, which is the accessibility program, a fair amount of site work. And so the goal is to start those at the same time, probably in late winter, early spring, which would probably be maybe late March, early April, and get those up and running. And what we still need to do is finalize our drawings, but we need to have a test hole dug next to the building. So he's trying to get an excavator that was used on another project of mine that's finished up, same contractor. And that project is same problems, dealing with the city of Boston and big delays. It's taken us months to typically get building permits from most towns. But anyway, he's going to try and get an excavator to dig a hole. And someone on the committee last year, I think, said, well, how about the foundation? And it was a valid comment because we're going to be cutting in along the north side of the building. So once we dig that test pit, then we can look at it with the structural engineer and see what kind of remedial work might have to be done to that foundation if we have to put a retaining wall up against it, or if the current plan, which kind of bends around it, will suffice. So that's more or less where we are. And the contractor, Synaxo, is really hoping to get that test hole dug before Christmas. He really wants to get that done before Christmas so we can take a look at it and start working and making some assumptions based on what we can see.
Thank you. And the previous grants prior to the 21 have all been completed. So
That's
the only
correct.
grants that are open right now are 21 and 22.
Right.
Are there other questions from committee members? Rose.
I've got another one. This is, it's not actually, well, maybe it's for John or I just want a clarification on the, I know the application has that the use it does include a shelter and but it's not being used. There isn't a residential use for this space.
No, that's changed. And that,
Yeah.
that might be my fault in missing that when we sent in the application materials.
Okay. And the idea is not to go back to having it be, there's no plan to have it go back to being a shelter.
I wouldn't rule that out. I think it's, I can't speak for Salvador and Lourdes, but I'm not sure if they're having difficulty renting the space. I just don't know what the situation is from their end of it, because their corporation owns the property and they rent out part of the space to a church. They originally had the daycare area on the lower level, and then they had the family area on the second. Now they have Kesher on the second floor, and I don't know if they've rented out the space on the first floor.
Okay.
I wish I could tell you more about that, but I don't know anything more than that at the moment. That space in the front is beautiful. The windows in the front of the building are spectacular, and luckily the storm windows, the exterior storm windows that have been in place for a long time, they protected most of those windows from weathering and damage. And some of the other stained glass windows that are more arts and crafts, not really liturgical, they've been protected by storms in most cases. Some cases they're broken, but a lot of them are in actually pretty good condition.
That's great.
Anything else I can help you with? I appreciate your questions. They're all very valid questions.
Thank you for squeezing us into your busy night, John.
Hey, that's okay. I just, I'm an architect during the day and I play music at night. So I like playing the French horn, and I play in a couple of community orchestras. So it's sort of it's the antidote to the stress during the day, to get stressed over the music. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. Well, thanks for your
Thank you.
time. I appreciate it. And if you have any more questions, I guess you could ask Roberta, and I'd be happy to respond to her if anything else comes up to clarify any issue. So should I sign out, Roberta?
Yeah, you can sign out. That's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
So do we have, Heather, were you able to join by phone? Or Tatiana? We can't actually see when there are phone callers in.
Mm.
So
Just keep it
I
interesting.
will. So it does say that Heather is self-muted right now. I don't know whether she's able to unself-mute herself. If you're speaking, Heather, we can't hear you. Okay, then Rose, perhaps you need to continue with chairing the meeting.
Okay.
And I just realized I'm probably still showing you everything that I'm looking at on the computer screen. So I will try to unshare. Okay. Or I can put the agenda back on the screen. That's what I should do. So I think you should have the agenda now.
Yep.
Next on the agenda is to approve the minutes from September 28 and October 26.
I thought they looked fine. I read through them.
Mm-hmm.
Can we make one motion for both, or do we have to do them separately?
I think you should do them separately.
Okay, so I will start with the September 28th minutes and make a motion to approve those. Unless other people have amendments.
Rose, you're chairing, so you're not going to second the
Oh,
motion.
that's right. Sorry. Okay.
I can second it.
Thank you, Jahan. I'll call the roll for you. So Dick,
I'm going to abstain since I was not at that meeting.
Laura,
Yeah, I made the motion.
yes. Oh, David,
Yeah, a very minor point. There's a typo in my name in the,
sorry.
not in the first, in the attendance thing, but in the first or second bullet I saw it earlier.
Okay. All right. And let me see who else we have here. Rebecca?
Is Rebecca here?
She's on the list. And Heather's on the list. Then I will count how many people have voted. I'm worried about our actually having a quorum without having all of the meeting members participating. Tatiana?
Can they vote just over? Can they vote in the chat? If they approve something, can they just write it in the chat?
I would think she can give a thumbs up.
Can I actually make a point of order on that? So we don't need to
Yes.
have a quorum or majority of the people voting. We simply need to have a quorum, a quorum of members at the meeting, and then we need a majority of whatever the vote is. So a vote of 1-0 is a perfectly good vote as long as we have a quorum. So we don't need to have those other people here in order to be able to cast votes as long as we have a quorum at the meeting.
Yeah. I'm just concerned about whether we actually, like, I think some of our members are ambiguously present.
Rebecca,
So,
can you hear me?
yes.
This is Rebecca. My computer just got kicked off and I am now back. So I don't know if that solves the quorum issue, but
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
But our quorum is 5, right?
Yeah. 1, 2,
So there are
3. Yeah. So you're 5 people on the screen.
5 people
So
not counting Rebecca. So even better if we have her. So I think we are good.
Good. All right. Thank you. Sorry for that. All right. Then a motion for approving the meeting minutes from the last meeting.
26, right.
So moved.
I'll second it.
All right. And I'll call the roll. Jahan,
Yes.
Rose,
Yes.
David,
Yes.
Laura,
Yes.
As you seconded the motion and Dick
I
made
did
the
second
motion.
it, yeah.
All right.
Yes, and I also wanted to just,
And
that they were very good minutes, so thank you for all of the work that went into them.
Yes.
thank you. I appreciate that. Then, and Rebecca.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. And Heather or Tatiana? We still don't have them. All right. So,
I could, by the way, make one more point of order, which is even though people have made motions or seconded them, doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually going to vote in favor of them. I think on this committee, it typically does mean that, but it is not uncommon for people to make motions and then for the purpose of getting the issue out, but then either abstain or vote against it.
thank you. I've chaired, I mean, I've worked with committees who vote if they make a motion and committees who don't, and I forget sometimes which, what is your practice in this committee? So I think you're right that I should allow you to vote.
Better practice to actually have people vote, I think. Then there's no ambiguity about it.
I agree. Thank you. All right. Next on the agenda is presentation of the fall report, which I put into your meeting packet. And I will open that report. I am showing the, I had an ambition of making a PowerPoint presentation of this report, but I was still rushing to actually get the status updates done today, so I didn't get that far. So the fall report covers a few topics that I thought were really important to help you begin your decision making about this funding round. First of all, how much funds do you actually have available? Secondly, what are the project updates on the projects that you have funded in the past? And finally, looking at off-cycle applications, what might you expect coming down the road that you might want to take into consideration as you decide how much of the funding you're going to put toward the current slate of projects. So back up to the top, you currently, right now,
Rebecca, sorry.
Go ahead.
Roberta, can I just ask, can you just maximize it? I know everybody's got this in front of them, but I'm wondering if what happens if you maximize if you go up to the top and blow up the up to the square. Yeah. Ooh.
I can
and then go.
still
Yeah, that would be great.
enlarge it on the screen.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep. Is that better? All right. So the current year funds available for all of the program areas is $3,224,000 shown in this chart on the first page. And this includes looking down at the table 1, this is based on what the CPC decided in your spring annual review, the community preservation plan for this year. You decided on what share of the budgeted revenue would go to each of the categories shown above. So right off the bat, 50% of the revenue is meant to go to the community housing reserve or has been appropriated to the community housing reserve. And that leaves 20% open space and recreation reserve, which is $772,000. 15% going to the historic reserve, that is $448,000. And then the budgeted reserve are your flexible funds that you could commit to any of those three categories, and that's $386,000. Ordinarily, in previous years, at this time of year, you have made a budget correction. A budget correction is to account for funds that were received from last year and were never budgeted. As it turns out, the estimated revenue last year, shown in Table 3, unappropriated FY22 funds, the estimated revenue for FY22 was actually very close to the actual revenue that was received. There was only $27,000 received above and beyond what had been appropriated in FY22, which would be the only revenue that we would add to this year's revenue, to the funding that's available this year. And I felt that $27,000 was such a small amount, it wasn't worth asking City Council to appropriate additional money to add to the available revenue this year. So we're going to stick with what was the estimated FY23 budget.
I have a quick question, Roberta. So what
Yes.
happens to that unappropriated 2022 money then, if you don't request that it be appropriated to us?
It will be carried over. That's a great segue to the next section of the report. I'm just going to take a note because I just noticed that I have a wrong number in the middle column, adjusted revenue. And I'm going to make myself a note to change that.
I usually get paid for those, segue questions, by the way.
So the next question, or the next topic that I'm going to cover is funds carried over from prior years. I understood that within our accounts, there is money that we've carried over from year to year and have not been spending. And so I wanted to look carefully at how much money there actually is in each of the accounts and why it's there. And so there's a narrative explaining all of this in the report. So Table 5 explains funds carried over from previous years, is shown in the, so it's in the undesignated fund balance, the open space and recreation reserve, and the historic preservation reserve all have funds carried over. The reasons why the funds are carried over is firstly because unspent administrative funds and budgeted reserve funds every year are transferred into the undesignated fund balance at the end of the year. And so most years we haven't spent all of the administrative budget, and some years we haven't spent all of the flexible balance reserve each year. So those get carried over into the undesignated fund balance. And then any additional revenues that have not been appropriated into the program area reserves remain in the undesignated fund balance. So that's the question that you just asked, that $27,000 that we never appropriated in FY22, we're not appropriating it now in FY23. That means that that's going to be added to this undesignated fund balance next year. That'll be carried over funding. And the program area reserves, the reason why there is money in these reserve accounts is because, first of all, we haven't spent all of the money every year in the open space and recreation reserves, so we've carried over some. And secondly, we have canceled out some projects or closed out projects that came in under budget. And that returns some funding to those reserves. Whenever a project is closed out under budget or canceled, then the money goes back into the account from which it came, from which it was originally appropriated. And one caveat that we need to always keep track of is the recommendation that the committee made for Art Farm, which was a fairly large project, where the committee recommended appropriating 367,000 from the open space reserve and 174,000 from the undesignated fund balance, which city council has never approved. So they could put it on the warrant and approve it anytime. And so the CPC needs to keep those funds available in case that project ever moves forward. There was also an amount to be bonded, which the CPC doesn't need to worry about at this time because you won't have to make any payments toward that bond until sometime in the future. So you don't have a commitment right now that is attached to the to be bonded amount.
Roberta, is there some way at some point to close out the Art Farm money since it's a lot sitting there?
Yeah, there is. Let's come back. I'll finish explaining this and then we can revisit Art Farm. So just the funds that are carried over from prior years, subtracting Art Farm, we have 1.5 million carried over in the undesignated fund balance and 162,000 currently in the open space and recreation reserve, but next year we'll be adding another 116,000 due to projects that closed out this year that will not actually be available until the FY24 funding year. And then historic preservation reserve, likewise, there's a small amount of money available now and a smaller amount that we anticipate will be available in FY24.
Roberta?
Yes.
Roberta? Why doesn't, I'm not sure I entirely understand. Oh, okay, never mind. I was looking at the wrong number. So the 367 from the open space recreation shows it as the negative because it's been up, because it was already obligated to the Art Farm. Okay.
Yes.
At first I wasn't seeing the numbers lining up, and now you went back up, I see they do.
Yeah. So the question about Art Farm, we had talked about this a couple months ago when Rebecca gave us an update on all of the PSUF projects, and we talked about Art Farm at the time. So a process for closing out the Art Farm project would be to ask that the city departments that initially submitted that application come back to the committee, invite them to come to the committee and have a discussion about the next steps for that project. I believe that the contact person for the city is Luisa Oliveira from PSUF, although it's a multi-department project. She's not the only person involved. And then based on a discussion with them, then I think I would suggest that the committee come to a consensus with them about whether to move forward or whether to request that they submit a memorandum withdrawing the application.
So quick follow-up. So there's no, the money never expires? I mean, there isn't like some period of years after, that it needs to be obligated or spent or something? If we have to
CPA money never expires.
Whenever I've dealt with other grants in the past, it usually has to be obligated in a certain number of years.
So the CPA funds that are in these balances never expire. This is always the city's money and it will always sit in this account until we use it. But it is actually something to consider whether you want to time limit some grants or require that the grantees come back to discuss with the committee if the projects get stalled. If it's an outside organization, not the city of Somerville, then there's automatically a 3-year limit on the contract. Then they have to come back and request to renew the contract, and that has to be approved by city council. So we've had a couple of organizations have to do that. Most recently, the Somerville Community Growing Center had to renew their contract to be able to finish the project that they closed out last year. And Blessing of the Bay also had to renew their 3-year contract for the project that they anticipate finishing next year. But when the projects are within the city of Somerville, there isn't an automatic renewal process built in. And maybe that's something that the committee wants to consider as you place conditions or establish a policy with respect to the projects, whether you'd like to. I would suggest not have it automatically expire, but after a certain period of time, have the grantee request to continue the project so that that's a discussion that you can have together.
I would actually kind of prefer it probably to expire and then have an opportunity for us to extend it. You know, when they come in and they say, here's why we didn't spend it in this first 3 years or whatever we think is reasonable. And then, it's not automatically revoked, but then, the committee could say, yes, we agree with that and we'll extend it for, X number of additional years.
Mm-hmm. Just as you think about that, I'm scrolling down. So the next section, again, a great segue. The next section of the project updates is, the next section of this report is project updates. And just as I think about the question that you just raised, looking at projects that have been completed, canceled, or closed out within the last 1 to 2 years, how many of these projects, especially, how many of these projects have gone back more than 3 years before they were able to be completed? It would be fair to ask why it's taken that long for some of those projects.
Right, and that's why my inclination is
Yeah.
for them to have to come to us and explain why they should continue to have access to this money, not us to have to go to them and say, can we pretty please have our money back?
Right. Yeah. That's a great point. And I think that's yes.
So I thought I'm sorry, my connection got unstable when you were talking about Art Farm, but I thought that we had asked to cancel that grant and close that out, and that the PSEF sort of said that they wanted to continue to hold it. So that puts us in an awkward place, to David's point, where if it was automatically expired after not being used for X many years, we don't get into this thing with a city department where they're saying, well, we haven't used it in 5 years, but we want to continue to hold it.
Right. And Art Farm has not even been approved by City Council. That's so that's another level of limbo that project is stuck in. I would highly recommend that we invite PSEF, the partners on that project, to come and speak with the committee to make a case for whether or not the project ought to be canceled. Because I'm afraid that the committee doesn't have all of the information right now that you would need to know. And I would want to hear what their explanation is of the current status of the project before the committee makes a decision about what to do with that recommendation.
Do we even have the authority? I mean, under the terms that we gave it to them to put a sunset on it, or is that something we could only do moving forward with future grants?
Well, that project, since it hasn't been approved by City Council, I think that you could potentially withdraw the recommendation.
Well, I mean, because we're going to have
The recommendation at this point is 5 years old, or how old? It's not current by any means.
I think it was on that previous.
Yeah, let me,
I think it was awarded the first year that we had CPA funds in Somerville. Or maybe not.
it was
So
on,
it's,
no, it wasn't quite that old.
It was originally awarded money, I think, before that. And that might have been additional.
It was discussed, but funds weren't awarded until FY19.
But I thought you said there's over $1 million. Is there over $1 million held, or it's just this 542?
No, it's just the 500 that's held, and then the additional amount has been, the committee recommended bonding, but
Okay.
but you don't have to hold those funds.
Yeah, so it's the 367 plus the 174.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, this table in the project update section shows projects that have been reserved for future use, which have not yet been implemented. So as you talk about a project sunsetting, if it's not used, a really, a good candidate for that might be either the LHD small grant program or the Kennedy Schoolyard. Those are both projects for which the funding has just been held. Well, the departments have been waiting to prepare the material to implement them.
We just got a presentation on the small grant program, though, right? That a couple of months ago.
So the first step that needed to take place for the small grant program was for both the CPC and the HPC to approve the program guidelines. And since I came here a year ago, I finished developing the program guidelines and brought them to both CPC and HPC. So the presentation that you were given was for the approval of those guidelines. Now that the guidelines have been approved, the city staff need to develop the application and promotional materials so that it actually goes out to the public. And that's the step that we're waiting for right now.
So is that in the hands of the city, whatever division it is? Is that just administrative, or does that need also city council approval?
That's just administrative. No further city council approval is needed for that.
So getting an update on that one is certainly reasonable. And going back to the art farm, Martin, if we want to have the city staff come and explain what they're thinking, I think that's fine. I also, though, might want to see if we can invite someone from city council to explain what they, why are they not, why are they sitting on it? If they even know they're sitting on it.
That I'm not sure who is behind the decision to sit on that. It may be because I think, that project, as far as I don't have all the information, this is why you need to have the various departments who are actually in charge coming in. It has to do with the other work that's needed on the site.
I think that's in Ward 2. It's over by Brick Bottom, and it's an area that's been heavily impacted by Green Line extension. And so I think there's been a lot of work that's been going on that site related to Green Line extension rather than art farm development. And so they almost need this whole current major infrastructure projects to finish up before they can then convert that site. So,
but as far as we know, the parcel is still intact. It's just it's just impacted by that, or is it kind of been carved up by some of that?
Yeah, and I think it maybe had some environmental cleanup they had to do. There was some below ground stuff going on too, but it's sort of in the middle of Green Line Epistorm.
My question for you is whether you would prefer to have, like, I will invite the staff to come and talk about those two projects, Art Farm and the small grant program, whether you would prefer to have them talk about that at your next upcoming meeting before you deliberate on all of the projects, or if that's something that you would want to make your recommendations for this year and then invite them to come in at the next available meeting after that.
Well, how would information we would get from them affect our this funding cycle? I guess to me would be the operative question as to when, would this, if they said, yeah, this isn't really going to go anywhere for a few years, why don't you take, I mean, I'm not expecting them to say this, but optimistically they'd say, we'll come back in 3 years when we think this project will be ripe, would that give us more money to spend this year, or is that something that would still be in a reserve fund anyway?
With respect to Art Farm, if you rescinded the recommendation for Art Farm right now, that money could be available to spend this year. And they could come back in a future year and ask to put, ask to fund the project all over again. I would just be, if I were in your shoes, I would be hesitant to do that without having them talk to us. So I would.
No, no, I think I was more responding to your question. Do we want them to talk before or after, we're making
with respect to projects that have already been funded, so these other projects on this list, for example, the Kennedy Schoolyard or the small property, the small grant program, those had been so the land acquisition study, the land acquisition fund was meant to be set aside indefinitely until an opportunity arises. But the small grant program and the Kennedy Schoolyard were intended to go forward immediately at the time that they were funded. And if you were to revoke those grants now so that they so that the money could be canceled and put back into your account, that wouldn't become available until FY24.
I think
maybe even the following year at this point.
I mean, my inclination would be, especially for those two projects, rather than coming back and say, like you're saying before, what's your plan? When is the Kennedy School? When do you think that's going to be at the top of your queue? It's already been 3 years. And maybe us saying we want to plan, we want to be spending this in the next year or in the next 2 years is, maybe it will give the city some impetus to actually proceed with, project design.
So I don't know if, Rebecca, if this is something you can answer, but so for example, we have the 217 Somerville Ave PSF project that's for design grant request. Meanwhile, we have a grant request that's sitting in the queue for 3 years. What's the logic there between continuing to sort of grant monies for projects when not all the projects are when there's not the bandwidth to get them all done?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that, like Roberta said, the Art Farm project is not solely a PSF project. There's a lot of other folks that are involved, in particular, engineering and even planning, really, because there's a whole neighborhood plan that's going on over there. But there's also, a big stormwater infrastructure project that would have to be installed beneath Art Farm before Art Farm could be constructed. Whereas 217 or Somerville Junction, those are piece-off projects that we sort of have the ability to do, more or less without the other divisions. So, we would be able to complete 217 Somerville Ave and Somerville Junction much more quickly. So I think that, you all have the right inclination that, having Louisa probably, and maybe others, maybe someone from engineering. Jonathan Smith is the project manager for the stormwater infrastructure project beneath Art Farm. Maybe speaking with them is the next best for Art Farm. Seems to me that funding would be better used for the projects that can move forward right now, right? Like if we could allocate that funding that was for Art Farm to 217 or Junction or other projects that could happen on a faster timeline, I think that makes more sense. But I also, today is actually my last day with the city, and so I don't want to speak for Louisa and the rest of the team. But that's my understanding of what's going on.
And in terms of the Kennedy Schoolyard, I have the feeling since the other school design projects that we've funded in the past are largely completed now,
Yep.
Maybe the Kennedy School will be coming up in the queue.
That sounds right to me, although one thing I couldn't get a good understanding, and this would be a good question for Louisa too, and or Arn, who was the project manager for that one, is if there was some other holdup. I couldn't get a sense if there was some political reason or some other reason why that project was held up. So I think it's the Kennedy School is another one worth asking about.
Yeah.
Rebecca, do you know if the Kennedy School had been funded by the city council instead of us, would there have been a time frame that the city needed to do it by, allocate that funding?
I don't know. I'm really not sure. It's a good question, but I don't know.
Because I'm also wondering whether our projects get pushed down the queue, because they have to spend the other money sooner.
Sure.
Because that money does come with more stipulations.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, definitely that is the case with some grants, right? Some grants need to be spent within, 12 or 24 months. And so, yes, oftentimes those projects take priority when it comes to the capacity of the department, just because we'll lose the funding otherwise. And oftentimes, right, those grants are leveraging CPA money and vice versa. So, a lot of thought does go into how these projects are phased and how they're prioritized. But Art Farm is a particularly complex one, honestly.
I do get that.
Yeah.
I do get
that. One thing that I didn't mention that I really wanted to bring up with respect to the funds carried over from prior years, especially the undesignated fund balance, it was a decision that I think a very prudent decision that the CPC made in the first year of funding to not spend the first year's funds, but to hold them over. And that's one reason why you have such a large amount carried over from prior years. The reason for holding some pool of money within that undesignated fund balance is because it gives the CPC some flexibility and an assurance of solvency, so that as long as there are funds carried over in that balance, if you have an emergency that pops up, you can dip into that to be able to cover it. Every year when we do the every year until now, whenever we've done the budget correction in the fall, we're actually using the undesignated fund balance to carry the amount of funds that we're making available this year, because they don't actually become available until a year later. We just, the way that municipal finance works, you can't touch money that hasn't been appropriated in the year it was budgeted until it's 2 years old. So that's why when we put the money back from these projects that get closed out, we have to wait 2 years before we're allowed to touch that money that came back. So the undesignated fund balance is a safety valve that is important to maintain, but there isn't a specific amount that you need to maintain in the undesignated fund balance. So I just wanted to make sure that I put that point out there.
But going back to my initial question, the 27,000 would just get added to that.
Yes.
And does it get allocated by just the normal allocation, 50% for housing? And
No, it's going to, in the future, it's going to be part of this number. It's going to be part of the funds carried over.
Right, okay.
I'm sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the funds, the other thing to mention about the funds carried over is that these funds can only be used for program area purposes. So they can never be used for administrative purposes.
Are they available for us to dip into if someone comes to us and says, the costs are, 30% higher than we anticipated when we submitted our proposal?
Once again, that is the perfect segue question to the next section of the report.
Add it to my tab.
So that's where the off-cycle applications come in. The 2 off-cycle applications that we received this year, that is exactly what we did. We dipped into that undesignated fund balance to pay for those 2 projects. So that was $100,000 to the Somerville Museum and $60,000, $155 to Broadway House that we approved this year. But so I've looked in the past to see what we've done when there have been off-cycle applications. In some years, the off-cycle applications have come out of the current year's available funds budget, and in some years it's come out of the carried over budget. There's there are reasons why you would it's beneficial to do it either way. If you take the funds out of the current year budget, then that's less money that's available for the projects that have applied for CPA funding this year. But if you take the funds out of the carried over undesignated fund balance, that that eventually is going to become depleted to a point that it doesn't serve the function that you have it for. And again, I mean, either way, it's going to be a first come, first serve situation. So you want to be judicious about how much money you're going to draw out of the undesignated fund balance for that purpose, or take out of the current funding year. Those are the 2 options for where the off-cycle funds can come from. And then the other question is, under what circumstances will you accept an off-cycle application? So we've seen applications for cost overruns. I think most of the off-cycle applications, if not all of the off-cycle applications that you've received so far, have either been cost overruns or major change orders on ongoing projects due to some structural emergency that occurred. But we have one potential off-cycle application that may be anticipated over the winter in FY20 and in 2023, which is I mentioned at the end of the report There's an affordable housing development that is in planning stages right now that is putting together the funding for a project where the project is a redevelopment site where they've demolished a building and are building an affordable housing development. And when the building was demolished, they were required to save a window from the historic building and install that into the new building. And an estimated cost for the restoration and preservation of that window and reinstallation is maybe in the order of $50,000. And I've been talking with the developer, and they're talking with HPC, and there's a chance that they may come to the CPC with an off-cycle application for that project. Other projects that we could anticipate over the next year in the category of cost overruns, looking at the current project status update, the only two projects that really stick out as potentially having cost overruns would be the Broadway Winter Hill Church Bell Tower, which is under construction right now, and the Glen Street Community Garden, which has not yet gone out to bid right now. And so we could think about the scale of those projects and what is the probability that they're going to come back with cost overruns as you think about how to respond to the demands for funds this year.
I think it's possible that Grace Church, once they start doing this, in order for them to put in that accessible ramp to the basement, they're going to be exposing a lot of the building foundation. And I think it's quite possible that they're going to have to come back for off-cycle funds once they get into that project.
I think it's quite possible that all the construction projects will come back for additional funds based on what I see in my daily work.
What's going on in the industry.
Yeah.
So
every project that I have is coming in with cost overruns and looking for extra time.
Yeah. So I looked at the other projects. Grace Baptist Church, I was my prediction is that if they do see a cost overrun, they've got many different elements of their project that they're working on right now in the FY21 and 22 grants, so that they might be able to come back to us with a request to change the scope in order to shift the funds around that we've already given them before coming back for more money, so that they might come back in the next funding round with a request for more money to cover a cost difference, but that they could likely be able to continue with the scope that they already have. I mean, you might make a different prediction about them.
Yeah, no, I mean,
and then the Somerville Museum and Broadway House are really the only other two construction projects that are at a stage right now where they might come in with cost overruns, and they've already asked for more money. So hopefully they already have covered their need.
So I guess part of what we're trying to get to is, with our flexible funds this year, are we going to be taking a certain slice of them out of the pie to save to be available next year for emergency funds? Or are we thinking that any emergency funds that we need to use, we will be dipping into these historical funds that are more than 2 years old? That's a part of the strategy in having this conversation now prior to awarding the grants is to make this decision about how much are we going to spend down of this year's undesignated.
Yeah, Exactly. So that's all of this fall report is really information that I think is going to help you think about how much money to commit to the projects in this funding round. And that is exactly what you just described, is an approach that I've seen communities take to set money aside out of the current funding round for off-cycle applications going forward. So Somerville has never taken that approach before, to my knowledge, but that is something that could be done.
Well, one of the lines in that first,
If I may, actually, in earlier years, we did that a few times.
Okay.
Was to
Yeah.
deliberately leave money in the account in order to be able to carry over into subsequent years or needs.
Yeah.
And off cycle, and we did off cycle funding, I think, for the waterworks project, which came in at a substantial cost overruns, some of which they found some other money for, and some of which we came up with to make it work.
On one of the first tables, there was a reserve fund, though, set aside for this year's funds. So how is that different from what we're talking about?
That the budgeted reserve, let me pull that up again. Budgeted reserve is what we call flexible funds. That is money that can be allocated to any of the 3 program areas. And it is often used if there's more funds requested in one of the categories, usually the historic or open space category, that you can use the budgeted reserve to cover the gap. So for example, last year we dipped into the budgeted reserve to cover some of the historic preservation projects.
Is there any functional difference between that and the carryover fund?
Only that the budgeted reserve is what we have recognized as being available in this year's revenue.
Okay.
And the carryover funds is historic money.
So if we didn't use that, would that get converted to carryover next year?
Budgeted reserve would, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, all of these, if we don't use it, it gets carried over.
But that particular one, I guess I was just thinking.
Yeah, so the budgeted reserve, if it's carried over, goes to the undesignated.
Okay.
So when we say that we have 1,610,000 and change in our budget for this year, in our corrected budget for this year, that's not acknowledging any of the sort of historical funds which are still there in the background and available to us for emergency funding, which is over $1 million, $1,500,000 that we have in that historical account.
Correct.
Okay.
So I also provided in your meeting packet, and we'll look at when we move on to the next discussion, a scenario of how much money is available and how much the current projects are applications are requesting. And so that is only looking at the current year's revenue. With the exception that I did create a scenario where I pulled forward the open space and recreation carried over funds. In case that was something that you wanted to consider. I don't know if you want to put aside, wrap up the discussion about the fall report, and I could begin to move on to the discussion of the current list of projects.
I think just to kind of wrap up this conversation a little bit, I guess part of what we need to decide is, do we want to, when we know that we have categories that are overrunning our silos for this year. So if we wanted to put more.
Oh, you're Heather,
money
wait,
into historic preservation or into open space, would we want to go ahead and use the Can you hear me?
You're back now. Yeah, you're back now.
Intermittently.
It's a lag.
I'm back. Okay.
Oh,
Now we can't hear you.
All right.
Go
So
ahead.
I guess strategically, what we want. Can you hear me?
Yes, but there's a
Can you hear
lag.
me?
Only when you
And
say, can we hear you?
Oh my gosh. So I was asking the question is whether we strategically want to use historical funds that are already earmarked for a category and try to build build up funds that are not earmarked for any particular category. You know, like, do we want to spend down the ones that are specifically earmarked and try to build truly flexible funds in the reserve, or do we continue to spend from our undesignated flexible funds? Just as a strategy for the committee to consider which way we want to go with that.
If I'm understanding correctly, the carryover fund, which is designated, when you subtract what's being held in reserve for the ant farm, is only about $118,000, you know, in the open space fund. I think the rest was in the undesignated.
Yeah.
And you know, and of course the problem with the open space is you need to have a project to spend it on.
Yep.
You know, I mean, what we could do with the open space money is we could encourage, you know, the city to ask us to put that into the open space reserve that we've been funding the last couple of years. You know, and so it's just, so at least it's ready, you know, but it also sounds to me like it's available if some project came up and we needed another $118,000 anyway. Is that correct, Roberta?
Yes,
Yeah.
actually, if an open space project, one of the projects on the list that I had for construction projects is an open space project. The other was a historic preservation project. So it is, let me just go back and look at which projects I highlighted. They were Broadway Winter Hill Church, the Bell Tower, and Glen Street Community Garden. So that could be an approach to hold on to your open space and recreation reserve to pay for the cost overrun for an open space and recreation project. So that's an option that you can consider.
Okay, thanks. Feel free to go on to the next part.
All right,
Or
can I
Rose?
Rose?
ask, just as we get into this, I know that we have a half an hour left. I feel like it would be really helpful, Roberta, if we could say, because I know that we're going to do this, we can't do this all tonight, right? That the idea is that we're doing all of the proposals tonight. So, so we get into a couple of them tonight, and then the December meeting, the goal is to wrap them up in the December meeting. Is that right?
I think that what might be productive, so I mean, whatever the committee wants to do, this is like beginning our deliberation process or your deliberation process. And so I'll follow your lead. I'm trying to provide you with as much helpful material as I can to help you navigate this process. My thought was that maybe I could just go through the material that I've given you, and then the committee, it's up to you to think about how you want to begin to discern what scenarios, you know, how you want to fund the projects. So I maybe could spend a couple of minutes going through each of the 2 tools that I put in your meeting packet. And then I'll turn the discussion over to you all. The first thing that I wanted to bring up is sharing my screen again. Yep. And let me it's very hard for me to see this while I'm navigating GoToMeeting. So this file, this is the summary of all of the projects. And in this summary, I have included an alternative phased scenario, which was just looking at the applications and what the applicants have told us they would accept, you know, as their minimum funding, their minimum phasing scenario. I created this column, and then there's an explanation of what's included in that alternative phased scenario in this column. And then I've created this column, draft funding scenario, where you give me the numbers and I'll drop them in here, and then they will add up and we'll see where we end up. And so at the bottom is the analysis of how much funding is available. And you'll have to excuse me while I try to get enough of GoToMeeting off of my screen so that I can see the spreadsheet. So the column C shows the funds that are available for the current revenue year. And then I also just showed what the carried over open space and recreation funds are in case you wanted to add those to the funds that you make available for this funding round. And so the initial ask is this column O, and this is what the amount that's requested is just on the face of all of the applications. And then applying that minimum phased scenario, this is the amount of funds that are requested, which is actually pretty close to the total available. Let me see if I can make the freeze the pane so that we can see the total available. Okay, so freezing the total available column. So when I drop numbers in up above, we'll be able to compare what's actually available. And then I gave a little bit of an analysis over here about what if we use the flexible funding. So the first column is if all of the flexible funding went to the open space and recreation, taking out the carried over funds. So let's, you know, just as a, what would happen if you use the carried over funds and then the balance of the flexible funds went to open space and recreation, that would leave this amount available for historic preservation. And that would make the total historic preservation be this amount, which compares to, so that's 672 compared to the phased scenario of 548. And then if all of the flexible funds were used for historic preservation, that would look like this. So these two numbers represent perhaps what might be the range of funds that are available for historic preservation using flexible funds. So I just wanted to show this to you. Now I'll bring forward the other evaluation materials, which is the evaluation criteria workbook. I don't know if any of you spent some time looking at this, maybe filling it out before this meeting, but I took the evaluation criteria that are in the application materials that we prepared this year, and so we've created a rubric by which we can evaluate each of the projects. And so you can put 3, 2, 1, or 0. in each cell for each of the projects. So I've created a column for each of the applications that we have. And the carriage house, actually, I will delete that because since I set this up, they contacted me to request canceling their project. So with that, I'd like to leave it open to you to decide how you're going to structure this conversation.
Roberta, before we move on to the discussion, I just have a point of clarification. If you don't mind going back to the other spreadsheet, I think it's the CPA application, project applications.
Yep.
So if you look at cell C17, where it says the HP total, actually, if you don't mind scrolling down, yep, right there, 451. I think in your fall report, it says the amount, maybe I'm misreading it, it says the amount available is 448,287. I just wanted to double check. It's a few $1,000s, but you know, it may have an impact.
Yes, thank you for picking that up. I did not make a last comparison between the two, so I began this spreadsheet some months ago, and if the numbers have updated, I might not have caught them. So this is the amount that should be in each of those cells that's available. So yeah, I'll make that correction.
Sounds good, Roberta. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So on the criteria rubric that you had, I think that I did try to use it, and I think as a discussion for another meeting and another day could be, you know, massaging and sort of improving this rubric. But I also just want to point out to people that there's a second worksheet that has the environmental justice map in it, with all of the projects very nicely labeled and located on it. So it's a really useful document, and I found it a useful exercise to try and go through and rank them, and I was surprised at actually some of the results that I got. So I think it's an interesting thing to try and kind of develop as we go forward and strengthen. So we have some time remaining this evening. Do we want to try some pricing scenarios? Do we want to discuss any projects that rise to the top as you know, concerns, or something we want to look into before the next meeting? I feel like either one of those could be a good way forward. Rose?
And I would just add to that, to me, it feels like the evaluation is a key step before we get into fund allocations, because it could be that this is that through the evaluation criteria and the ranking, that it's sort of that it's clear that it doesn't, that there are some there could be projects that that rank low and don't necessarily come forward as a top priority for funding. So I'm just trying to figure out how we do, what the best way to do. I mean, it's a great form. I have to fess up that I have not gone through and ranked the projects using the form. Is it reasonable to think that we all as committee members could take the time to go through and do the ranking and then compile the rankings, so that we, by the December meeting, there's some sort of output that shows everybody's ranking? I mean, not specific, not individual rankings, but combines the rankings. And then we're allocating it, and then we're discussing sort of everybody's input that way.
So I'm interested in other people's ideas, feelings about that. I think that the thing about the ranking is that you do have to bring some of your own sort of interpreting interpreting some of it, you know. So I wouldn't go straight off the ranking, but it is a useful tool. I think the long and the short of it is that we are we're in pretty good stead with a lot of the open space projects, and I feel like we are consistently told that the open space is a high priority. This sort of comes up as number 2, affordable housing, and then open space, and then preservation. So I think the really tricky part of allocating funds this year is really going to be within the historic preservation column, where we have a huge amount of grantees. So I think in particular, if people could go through and rank the historic preservation projects and focus on that, that would be very helpful. And if you have time to do open space as well, great. But I anticipate that probably the open space projects will, just given sort of the mandate and the fact that we actually have a number of strong open space projects this year, I suspect we're going to try to fund them all.
I
Jahan?
want to suggest taking a somewhat different approach in thinking about it. One of them is, well, I think everything that you said about open space is true. The amount of the request is still 1.1 million, and we have less than 3/4 of that in the line, which means we still have to confront a bunch of hard choices, either of cutting down from what is proposed on open space or taking money from the flexible to make up the difference, which is, in this context, means taking it away from historic. So I think it's hard to say, well, open space we can think of separately from historic, because both of them are going to be competing for those flexible funds on it.
Yes, that's true.
At the same time, it is certainly true that open space is a priority, and that even leaving aside the flexible funds, the funding in the open space item, although it's less than 3/4, is almost 3/4, whereas the discrepancy on the historic between the amount of money that's available and the amount that's requested is much, much larger.
One thing I didn't mention before that I just wanted to make sure that I bring up is, in addition to looking at your evaluation criteria and the potential phasing and competition between the projects, to consider the readiness to proceed. And I just received some communication. Actually, I think I might be able to put a letter into your meeting packet after the fact that I didn't remember to put in the meeting packet beforehand, from Capital Projects and the Economic Development Division, saying, updating that the timeline for 90 Union, for example, they think that maybe it could be accommodated next year because the timeline is, they've adjusted the timeline so that they think that it may be running longer than what they presented last month. And we also, we also may be finding more funding, or asking some other projects to see if they can ask for funding from other sources, such as ARPA or other sources within the city. is a question to ask.
Or
So I
you're
just
still
wanted to
talking
put,
you're still talking for 90 union for everything.
so 90 union, that may also be the case, but the other city projects,
Okay.
there may be opportunity for other sources of city funding, which hopefully I've asked them to let us know, but hopefully we'll know by next month if there will be, but I don't know for certain, but that's just something to consider, is whether other funding might become available that hasn't been reflected yet. But I'll step back again.
The other comment I wanted to make in terms of the worksheet, which I think is helpful for thinking about some of these, but from my perspective, it doesn't adequately capture some more fundamental kinds of things. So for example, and I apologize if I'm sort of reopening a conversation about this form that was done before I was on the committee, but the alignment with planning goals and objectives gets the same sort of 0, 1, 2, or 3 points that some of the other things like completion of the application does, or letters of support. Whereas in my mind, that one is potentially really, really large and may dwarf some of the other kinds of considerations. So I'll give a couple of examples, and this is sort of my perspective on some of these. One of them is one of the topics that we discussed earlier this evening when we were talking with the folks from the Cross Street building, which is, they said their top priority would be to fund the accessibility things because it totally changes the way in which they use the building and the kinds of programs they can bring into it, if there were enough money for that. But if there's not enough money, then they had a different set of priorities because essentially a half-done elevator is of no value to them at all. They can either cross over those thresholds or they can't. The Somerville Museum, to me, is a somewhat similar picture, but 3 or 4 years sort of farther along. So the Somerville Museum was also a place trying to do accessibility and major renovations on the building. And I think we as a committee really stretched to help them get across that line. They were partly the accessibility things there reflected sort of changing goals. You may not know, but originally they had a proposal that was just going to have a lift on the outside, which they thought was going to be acceptable to the Architectural Barriers Board. And then the Architectural Barriers Board came back and said, no, that's not okay. You actually need an elevator that has to go to all of the floors. And then they developed some plans for the building to do the bump out on it. And the Historic Preservation Commission said that really doesn't cut it. You need to go back and do a redesign, which made it more expensive. And then they also had major delay because they got sued by the abutter about whether they were going to be able to do this work. And then by the time that was over, costs had gone up enormously. So the combination of all of that was the target kept changing, it kept being more expensive. And we as a committee made essentially a commitment that we were going to stretch to get them over that line. That the building, that sort of dribs and drabs of money in a building that was not accessible was not the same as doing what was necessary to make it accessible. My opinion is that that was good judgment on our part to do that. And conversely, although we're not talking about these in details, my inclination is for the Somerville Museum's request this time would be to say, now it's somebody else's turn to be at the front for big money that's going to get people across the line. And I would characterize all of that sort of under priorities, not in the general sense of historic preservation, but in a much more qualitatively different sense that that looks at what the impact of our funding is going to have on these projects. And so while I think it's good to do the worksheet, and see what it can tell us. I would urge people not to treat that as sort of being a simple, easy way to figure out how to allocate funds. This one got 12 points, this one got only 9, so let's put more money into the 12 point, because I think there are aspects to these projects that are qualitatively different and are not captured by those kinds of numbers.
I support that, and I'll just be quick, and then you can take it, Laura. I think the other thing that it sort of doesn't reflect is sort of organizational stability, or like if this organization's had, for example, Grace Baptist, 59 Cross Street, that they've had grants before that they haven't managed to complete. So they're should they wait until they've actually finished projects already awarded before they come back and ask for even more money? So there's an element about certain organizations' track record that I think is also important and isn't immediately reflected in the rubric.
Mm. Yeah, I was just gonna kind of dovetail on what Dick was saying about not relying strictly on the forms. I think it was Rose who suggested maybe we all do them and to kind of do an amalgamation of all our scores. And something about that like makes me almost a little nervous because there's not enough back and forth. I mean, I did mine and I have scores, but even those I don't quite trust, if you know what I'm saying. And what Dick just said about the museum really resonates with me because he's got a lot of institutional knowledge. He predates all of us, and so just to sort of bring that lens and add that to as part of the discussion, just the history and asking the museum to consider other sources this next round feels like a reasonable ask, given all the requests we have. We have, a very small amount of money compared to the requests, and so as it's been said, we have tough choices to make, and so that's relevant. That's all relevant. And then again, just to be aware of the time, we have these tough choices to make and discussions to have. So obviously we're not going to do it all tonight. Maybe, go back and do our little cheat sheets. Everybody does them and then come back with clear thinking. I actually, about clearer thoughts about what we're thinking about these projects. I found, Roberta, when you were going over that other sheet that, and just talking in general about the projects, and that I think that could actually be helpful to me as I think it through some more.
So the next time we meet, where we had wanted to be by the end of December was to have deliberated on the projects and to have approved recommendations, conditions that went along with these different grant awards. I think there's no way that's going to happen in one meeting because we need to draft them up, and then we need to discuss them, and then Roberta will draft them up, and then we kind of look at them again. So I'm wondering, how important is it that we finish this by the end of December? Is it okay if it sort of bumps into the January meeting, or do we need 2 meetings in December to finish this up in a timely manner? Is there, I know that the city council doesn't meet on these matters during December at all. So January would be the earliest that they would review the recommendations. So I guess I'm wondering, do people feel like we should have 2 meetings in December, or is there a reason why?
None
So
of
here
the
might be a place,
go ahead.
here might be a place in which some institutional memory may at least sort of inform people's thinking about it. We actually initially did these on quite a different schedule. I think making the recommendations in the spring. And we changed that in part because people's terms go to the end of the year. So as of January, there will presumably be new people replacing some of us. And so I think the idea was to see if we could get a cycle done before we lose people who have worked on it. For some of you all year, for me for a couple months. But the idea was to get it done before we lost people, so that when new people came in, they would be coming in at the beginning of next year's process and not at the tail end of this one.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, that's really helpful to know why we set the schedule the way we did. This is a self-imposed deadline, though, and none of the projects that I can see are very urgent right now on a tight timeline. I mean, there are projects that are very urgent in that they should have been done last year or 5 years ago, but I don't think that a couple of months is going to make a difference in terms of their being able to be done in time to meet a deadline.
Oh, and I have to admit, I don't remember off the top of my head, but Roberta, you had a whole calendar worked out, right? When we were gonna, so I don't know how this factors, this schedule factors into that, and whether there's some time in that and still meet that calendar. But I know
haven't
we
developed
talked about it,
calendar.
4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah, I haven't developed a calendar yet for 2023, so my calendar ends in December with a decision. And if we have to adjust our schedule to, I'll make next year's calendar based on what we think the schedule is going to be. It's meant to be a tool and not a whip. So
Sometimes you need a whip, but I do agree that it's a lot for us to do next month. And I was actually even already thinking, the fourth Wednesday, next month is between Christmas and New Year's, and I, for one, I'm not sure if I'm going to be traveling or not yet. So I was going to wonder if we wanted to do the same thing, and I think we did this last year too, is bump it forward a week like we just did this month. And in that scenario, getting 2 meetings in December is also kind of tight.
Yeah. The next meeting is scheduled for December 14.
Oh, we already did change it?
We did.
Okay.
So but that's also a good reminder. If we wanted to squeeze another meeting in, that would be very tight.
Mm-hmm.
I also did want to kind of echo what some of the other members have already said about, my inclination is I think it's a wonderful matrix that you put together. But I do agree with, some of, the other comments already about whether all of those things are equal. Is every 3 a 3 in my mind? And the answer probably is not. I don't think, how well it hews with our program is quite as, as important as how complete the application is, or how good their letter writing campaign was. But I do think it's still fine to use as a guide for kind of, qualitative, analysis. I just was not inclined to kind of come in and say, here was my score for that, for that project.
All right, so it's almost 8:30. We could, I guess we have to decide how we want to proceed. The 14th is 4 weeks away. So if we wanted to schedule a second meeting for December, we'd have to maybe spend some time now trying to identify a time that would work, or we just go with the December meeting and let things flow over into January. I think that everyone who's on this call tonight will continue to be on the committee in January. We're losing Rebecca, though. Rebecca, before we all sign off, I just want to do want to make sure that I say it's been a pleasure to work with you, and I really wish you the best in your next position. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So maybe just a show of hands, how many people would like to try and wrap this up in December and schedule a second meeting to make sure that we do that? Yeah, I have my hand up too.
It depends when.
Huh? We've got maybe 2.5.
Well, I understood the word try to be a really critical part in that proposal.
Yeah. So perhaps it's, if we don't want to do it that way, perhaps people can work on their own budget allocations a little bit so that we come with proposals to the meeting on the 14th, and that may be a way in which we can sort of jump into it. And I'm willing to stay a little bit past 8:30 if people want to discuss projects a little bit more right now. But if
Well, I don't think a meeting that I've been on has ended at 8:30 yet. You know, so it never occurred to me we were going to end at 8:30. But I do think that I'm not really sure how much more we can discuss until people take some time and look at the projects again and look at the matrix. And I do wonder if the more productive time is for us to do that. Come in with, like you suggested, our kind of straw man proposals next month, and then maybe next month, we can, discuss one another's ideas and maybe kind of bat some of the thinking around a little bit, and then hope to then maybe have a decision at the January meeting.
all right, how do people feel about that proposal? Okay.
But do I have to vote? Because it was my idea, but maybe I can still then say.
So I think we should come. People should come with their budget proposals to the next meeting. I would like to stay on a little bit longer and just. I personally have concerns about 159 Cross Street that I'd like to discuss, and if anybody else has projects that they either want to discuss concerns or express sort of an opinion about, it might be useful for people to hear before they work on their spreadsheets.
I'm perfectly happy to do that.
Okay.
I do want to make sure that we leave. You have to go?
I have a hard stop. Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody.
Okay. I did want to leave a couple minutes for other business. So I don't know if you want to take other business first before continuing the discussion. And Rose, I don't know if you.
Let's quickly do other business. Yeah.
Okay. So lightning round, update on the member search. The candidates are now posted on the city's website for public comment. You can find them by looking at the CPC's web page and invite your friends to see who the candidates are for the public member. As already announced, this is Rebecca's last meeting as she is leaving PSUF, and we'll look forward to having a new team member join us later. I don't think that anyone else from the current PSUF team is going to be taking her place. I believe that HPC has filled some of its vacancies. Maybe Dick, you can tell us more, but there are still some vacancies to fill. So please encourage anyone you know to apply.
As far as I know, none have been filled. I've been literally knocking on doors, not randomly, literally knocking on doors for new members. As far as I know, there are no new members, and we are down quite a bit. We're supposed to have 14, and we are at 5.
Oh, wow.
So
I have someone that might be interested.
Okay.
I will ask them.
Please do. And then if somebody's interested, then you can reach out to Roberta, who can connect you with Sarah and Wendy.
Exactly. And finally, just a reminder that we're supposed to have officer elections at the next meeting. Officers can serve 2 consecutive years, which means that Heather and Rose, if you wish, can continue, but we can still hold the elections next month if you wanted. And that's all I've got for other business, unless anyone else has some business to bring up. Great,
Okay, I'm gonna
as you
jump
were
off.
then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, so just with the Grace Baptist Church, I feel there's a lot of positives about it in terms of, you know, the mission of the organization, the location of the building, and just the incredible building that they have and that they're stewards of. My concern is that they have difficulty with the project management. And I am also pretty sure that we're going to be needing emergency funds, and that I also look at it and I think with like the gutter project and stuff, it's sort of like, well, this is one of those preservation things between sort of maintenance, deferred maintenance and preservation, which can be a very tricky line in historic buildings, but they kind of consistently don't show any kind of match coming from their own wherewithal or any aggressive sort of searching for other funding. And I just kind of feel like they've got their plates full with the monies we've already awarded them. They're probably going to need emergency funds to finish that, and maybe they should be strongly encouraged to pursue either other sources of funding, or I'm just concerned. I'm concerned about their ability to actually responsibly use these funds. And I love the building. I mean, it's an incredible building, but
Do we have a criteria to evaluate or review recipient or an applicant's wherewithal to do what they, you know, are what we're giving them money to do? And I mean, because I understand that, you know, you're concerned, and I think that they're valid. I'm just trying to figure out how do we equitably apply that standard, you know, across every, against the program, across the programs, you know, because it does feel to me like it would be it's a fraught, evaluation, you know, unless we have like kind of specific auditing tools.
I also want to weigh in with another consideration. We certainly want to make sure that the money we're giving is being used effectively, and we certainly want them to look for other resources too, because they need a lot of money and far more than we can provide for them, especially in any one year. On the other hand, they're an organization whose internal resources are limited. That's how they ended up where they are in all of this. So again, a comparison with the Somerville Museum, which had a lot more of those kinds of resources, contacts, people who could be on fundraising committees and make contact. So former Mayor Gene Brune led the fundraising for the final round of work at the museum. They got Mike Dukakis, the former governor, on board. And the folks at Cross Street just don't have those kinds of resources.
mm-hmm.
And in a better world, what we would be doing in part would be to help them find those sorts of resources, but we don't have the resources to do that kind of work. And so in evaluating them, I want to make sure that we recognize their limitations that are outside of their control and don't sort of hold them against them, that they really need help from us, and get told, well, because you really need help, we're not going to give you a lot of help, because the fact that you really need help means that your internal resources are limited. Whereas the Somerville Museum, which has more internal resources, is better placed to take advantage of what we can do and match it with other funds and so forth. And the result then could be sort of to increase the disparities between organizations that are doing important work in the community, and really need help, and those that actually have more resources, but because of that end up getting more help.
They laid out a plan though that is, oh, I forget what the total was if you added up all the phases together, but it's quite a sizable investment that they'd like to make in this building.
Yeah, it's like 1.3 million or something.
Yeah, and so it's sort of, and I don't know, and their tendencies sort of moving around, who's in the building, what they're doing. I just hope that they're really stable. And one idea that Roberta brought to the table was sort of, I mean, there is a restrictive covenant on the building that's held by Mass Historic. So it has a restrictive covenant on it, but just wanting to make sure that the investment that we're making is one that will.
But just to be clear, I mean, but my sense is the investment is in the building, though, right, and in the preservation of the structure. And even though I mean, I don't want anyone to fail. If they are applying for the funds and they hire responsible agents to execute the funds, and that happens, hasn't our objective been achieved, even if they may not be the best run organization?
Right. I definitely agree with what David just mentioned. Also, I would like to add that perhaps we could, in the next fiscal year, we could further scrutinize, the progress of the projects or the fundings that we provided, because I think that's going to be a helpful tool for us to rather closely monitor how the funds are being spent. So I definitely concur.
I agree strongly with that. I think that kind of goes back to the discussion we were having earlier too about, organizations that get money and then just sit on it, and that should kind of weigh against them, I think, when they come back and they ask for more money.
Mm-hmm.
Two things I wanted to just jump in and say is, the one thing regarding the organizations asking for money and sitting on it, we do need to keep into consideration that one of the reasons for sitting on the money is because of the city's slow processes with respect to permitting. So it's not entirely within their control. That's one of the reasons for delays. John Hecker also mentioned delays due to construction in general right now. And
Right.
we've also seen delays.
And I'm not looking to tie our hands and like tell someone after 3 years we have to take the money back. I'm looking though to have a process where we are affirmatively saying we understand why this is happening and it's okay, as opposed to it being theirs until they tell us, otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
It's just flipping the coin. It's not trying to dramatically change, nor and I would very much not want us to be bound to take it back after some X period of time without us having the ability to make an informed decision.
Mm-hmm.
For all the reasons that you say, Roberta, and probably for others, I'm not, we're not thinking of.
Do people feel comfortable with not setting aside money from this year's undesignated funds, knowing that we have a large purse in undesignated funds this year, and that we sort of try to allocate the entirety of this year's budget, including the undesignated funds, or the majority of it?
Heather, so I am clear, you're talking about the funds that are in this year's budget,
Yeah.
and not necessarily all of the carryover money.
And knowing that we have the carryover money, do we all feel good about spending the entirety of this year's budget
Yeah.
and not
And
putting more back into the undesignated, into the carryover?
Yes.
Yeah, I do too.
Do we
Okay.
want to think at all about spending down some of the carryover?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I mean, I don't know if whether we would have as like kind of I don't know. I don't have a sense of how quickly or when and how that accumulates again. But if it is something that kind of fairly reliably accumulates at a certain percentage, then I wouldn't have a problem with us having kind of a principle that we, would allocate 10% of it or 15%, some conservative amount of it. But only if there's like kind of a reasonable expectation, I think, that it's going to be maintained. Now, I mean, I think we should have a carryover that we carry forward of some amount, whether it has to be 1.5 or 1.7, million dollars, whatever it is. That may be larger than we need to carry over. So maybe our goal would be to decide what do we want to carry over, and then try and figure out a vehicle to, maintain that, something in that approximate balance, plus or minus 10%, or 15%. But I don't have any idea what a reasonable amount of carryover is.
Roberta, can you tell us, at least sort of in broad terms, where the funds that are in that carryover came from? How much of that was some years just not spending the full amount? How much of that was money being returned? Can you give us like a picture of where that money came from?
I'll have to do some further digging to see kind of what the budget looked like every year. I'm not sure. So I could probably first of all find out how much was carried over from the initial funding year. That might have been about maybe the 1.5 million, I'm not sure, or 1 million or so. And then how much has accumulated each year. Yeah, I have to do some more digging to find the answer.
But we have dipped into it. You were saying that the additional applications we got last year, we funded from the carryover.
So that was $160,000. So that's all that I've seen taken out of the undesignated, but I don't know. I haven't checked to see whether in prior years there was some. I did see some examples of taking off-cycle applications out of the current revenue in prior years, but I only looked back a couple of years, and there are some older projects that might have come out of undesignated that I didn't see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because if this was all from one big lump year when we just happened to not spend it all, and it doesn't really grow that much, each year, that would be good to know.
I mean, my impression, and but I think the bulk of that money, I think, must have accumulated during the 3 years that I was not on the committee. But that the bulk of it is simply monies that were not expended, as opposed to relatively small amounts coming back afterwards when a project came in under budget. It really means that the money that's in there is money that we deliberately chose to put in there rather than spend, even if in some years it meant not fully funding requests in order to be able to keep money. And if I'm right about that, then I think we can't spend all of the money this year saying, well, we've got other money and it keeps growing, because it only was growing when we chose not to spend the full amount of money we had available. That's not to say we shouldn't spend all of this year's, and maybe even some of the carryover, because it's pretty good sized. I mean, the amount of the carryover is about as much as all of the rest of the money we
Right,
have.
exactly, double.
Spend. But we also couldn't feel like, well, we can spend it without worrying about it because more is going to be coming in. I
And-
think it's not.
And like I was saying, you know, I'm sorry, Dave. But I think we're going to get additional supplement, you know, off-cycle requests because, I mean, especially, you know, what I'm seeing a lot of cost overruns are is any sort of like electrical equipment and, you know, I mean, just a lot of stuff it's hard to get, and when they get it, it's 50% more than they had planned for when they were first budgeting the project. Now, you know, Roberta, you may be right that because there's going to be delays, you know, they may just be able to say, well, we're not going to do that this year at all, and just reframe, you know, rephase the project. But
Well, the other example is one of the earlier years of the Somerville Museum. They asked for funding for a purpose that wasn't. Actually, it was what we just funded last year, the waterproofing the rest of the basement. They asked for funding for waterproofing the basement. They were given that funding, and then they came back to the CPC later that year and said, can we change the scope and actually put all of that money toward the elevator, and we'll come back next year and ask for the waterproofing. So that's what I'm envisioning might happen with the Grace Baptist Church, is that if they have an emergency within the year, they might be able to come back and change the scope so that they can cover the emergency and then in the future replace the funds that they needed to do the part that they thought they were going to do.
Just going back to Cross Street and what Dick was saying before about you know, not wanting to increase disparities and all. You know, when I did my little matrix form, this was one of the projects that had a somewhat lower score. Just it had to do with community support letters, I think, or what have you. But number aside, you know, I looked at that request and saw, oh gosh, 1.3 million. They're certainly not expecting to get that from us, all of it. And so I actually found the presentation at the beginning quite helpful. Clearly, you know, the application was parsed out, I think, into like 5 or 6 different chunks, somewhere between 60 and 300K. We, the committee, are going to like vet through and pick it out. And like, that's why his presentation today was so helpful at the beginning. And I mean, as I read through it myself, I thought, oh, these guys are gonna, they're obviously gonna have to look elsewhere for money, and they're probably gonna be reapplicants, just the same way the museum has been. The museum has come to us every year, at least once, since I've been on the committee in 2019. And, you know, we don't hold that against them per se, we factor that in, but we consider their applications every year. And I thought, oh, well, this Grace Baptist is likely gonna be another reapplicant like the museum is, right? So those are my thoughts. It's a careful line to walk, I guess, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, I think part of what I was thinking about the preservation projects is like with the Adams Magoon House, I just feel like it would be great if we could phase given the amount of support, and you know, that Sarah sort of came onto the meeting and personally, you know, sort of said, this is really a priority, this building, you know, and but so I looked at that and I was thinking it would be great to be able to do more than phase 1, because I just imagine that as they start to take this building apart to do this work, it's going to make sense to kind of do it all together rather than try to phase it, you know, just the way construction is. And so I was wondering about trying to kind of move that one up the you know, to give them more than one phase worth of money, and that would be, you know, needing to find monies from elsewhere or take monies from other projects. But it just felt like they were being cautious about just, you know, asking their phases, whereas perhaps we could encourage them to do more than phase one, if at all possible. And that's an unusual one because it's a private individual who owns the
Yeah,
house.
yeah. That was one of the ones that I had reservations about, actually, because it was private, because it was less accessible. And yet Sarah came on and made such a strong plug for it. So tough choices, you know?
Yeah.
In either case, you would be acquiring a preservation restriction on the property. So the city is acquiring an interest in that property,
Mhm.
whether it's owned by a nonprofit or by an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. And so,
Have we given money to private homes without public access in any other situation?
We have a little bit in two senses, one of which has not come to fruition, and Roberta, you may know of others. One of them is we gave money to restore a stained glass window in a historic house in Spring Hill, which did not already have a pre-existing preservation restriction on it. It had a fire. They did most of the restoration work themselves, and they asked for CPA funding to restore the stained glass window, exchange for which we got a preservation restriction on both the exterior and the interior of the building. The other is that we put a couple $100,000 into a fund for the HPC to manage, which has never gotten off the ground, where money would go to people in buildings in historic districts for use in preservation work. Yeah, I think the idea being somebody would say, you know, I want to cut some corners here because I can't afford it. And HPC would say, no, we really want you to do it the right way, and here's some money to help you do it.
Yeah.
So that
and
was
that's the one we were discussing earlier, where Roberta was saying, you know, we're sort of waiting for really the outward facing materials to be prepared and released to the public.
right.
But the guidelines are there, and it's really
It's an embarrassment that after all these years.
What we're talking about funding, you know, that sort of funding wouldn't touch, you know, Adam's, you know, the Adam
Right.
Magoon house, you know,
That's
what
right.
they're.
That's much smaller funding, but it is an example of the question you asked about, which is funding that would go into a private house that didn't have public accessibility.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good perspective.
I don't think I know of
It's
any other.
it is a lot of money.
It is. And I'm wondering whether we, particularly given that it, in fact, already is in a historic district. And so a restriction doesn't mean a great deal, whether if we put a significant amount of money in, we ought to be asking for more than just a restriction on it.
Well,
and I don't know what that would mean.
Yeah.
I'm just putting it out as a purely at a conceptual level.
Is the work all exterior work? I forget. Is it all work that's is it all
Yeah.
visible from the street or from
foundation, windows, sills, siding, that kind of.
And so
that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
you have to invite people to come and gawk at their house.
People do.
Yeah, no, I was saying, well, it's funny because what I was thinking, you know, and it's a really different context is how I don't think it's in Somerville, but Boston, how, you know, all those really fancy gardens open up their gardens, you know, one day a year, you know, to the public. And I assume it's because they got some big tax write-off at some point, you know, in exchange for, you know, opening their gardens for the day. And I was trying to think if there was some sort of a parallel we could, you know, try and do.
In the application, I mean, just to provide a little context of why this is in the application. In the application is a series of letters written by school children. This is because there are numerous elementary schools or schools in Somerville that bring their kids by that building to look at it as part of their like they take a walking tour of historic landmarks. And when Patricia has seen those schools go by, she actually will come out and talk to the kids and invite them to come and take a look at the house. And so those are kids, that was a classroom that got to actually go in and tour the house because
Okay.
she caught them coming and gawking.
So
So,
maybe they would be receptive to having an open house,
Yeah.
one day.
I think she'd be very receptive to that.
I think that would be a nice, I think that would be kind of a nice trade-off. I don't know.
Well, we've talked a little bit about the kind of the difference between access agreements, which can be sort of difficult, versus maybe use agreements that it should like stay as a certain type of use. And a
I've
good example of that's been the B'nai B'rith, who got money for accessibility, but they've been very reluctant to have sort of, to have access, public access. I mean, there is public access for people who are, coming to worship, but they don't, like kind of saying to them that we want public access has been unsuccessful.
Yeah.
I have been actually exploring this issue further with our own legal department and with other CPA communities and historic preservation experts. And I'm getting very mixed signals about how and whether to proceed with trying to make a condition based on use. The city our legal department is looking into what options we might have to be able to control the use. But in either case, I was encouraged to think that the preservation restriction alone is the city's interest in the property, and that sufficiently protects the asset, which is what the CPA is investing in the first place. And that neither a use agreement nor an access agreement it would be in the CPC's interest to enforce. So I would put that out there, but if it's something that you felt very strongly about, the committee has requested access agreements in the past, and we could continue to try to find a vehicle for ensuring some public access in the future. Excuse me. Another example besides B'nai B'rith is the Elizabeth Peabody House, where it really may not be appropriate to ask for any, public access, open public access, given that it's a childcare facility. And so most of the time they control who enters the building because it's utilized by childcare programs. And the 59 Cross Street, where it was a homeless shelter and now a childcare facility, likewise, they're spaces that provide a community service, but also spaces that require a certain amount of privacy. And so, I don't know. I would encourage you to think, maybe we won't talk about conditions until January, but maybe you need to have the conditions in mind before you're willing to think about what you want to fund. So,
Yeah.
I think it was a mistake, I think, for us to have funded the work at B'nai B'rith before we had nailed all of those things down. And I'm actually a member of B'nai B'rith, but as a member of the CPC, I'm quite unhappy with the way in which B'nai B'rith handled that. We just note one more thing about interior access, which is that the money at B'nai B'rith went into interior work. It went into an elevator to make it accessible. And CPA funds should not be used to fund an elevator for the use of the congregation. It was funded to make the building accessible to the public. And so, so if the building is not accessible, then the purpose of the CPA funds was not being met. And that's I think, qualitatively different from, I think, Elizabeth Peabody House, where the money that has gone in has been not money for the purpose of making the building accessible, but money for the purpose of preserving the building, such as the new roof.
Right, and by the same token, the Adam Magoon House, if the work is really being geared toward, preserving the exterior, and that's the goal of it, I would certainly, kind of back off, like, well, you should let us inside, because, maybe they shouldn't, and it shouldn't be a condition, that they let us inside, because the purpose of the thing I'm more concerned about is, and from whoever spoke, last month, it sounds like there aren't many other comparable, houses, but I just kind of think about precedent. Is, how many other private owners are going to say, we want $500,000 to restore our house too?
I mean, I think this building really is unusual, but
yeah, I probably should go by and see the building. I don't know the building by name. Maybe I know it from driving around Somerville, but I don't know the building.
The owner, after the work is done, wants to sell it. The building is now worth presumably $500,000 more.
Right. You were distinguishing public and public use. But I don't know, what's the difference? What are those two different?
The distinction I was making before was that the money that went into B'nai B'rith was money to put in an elevator, and so the justification.
Yeah, no, I understood that, but Roberta, you were talking about.
So my understanding. Yeah, so my understanding actually of why to put an elevator in either B'nai B'rith or in 59 Cross Street or the Somerville Museum is to make the historic building functional for its intended use. And its intended use is to be a nonprofit place of assembly, no matter what kind of assembly is going on in that building, whether it's a religious assembly, a cultural assembly, or a school assembly. Like, this is the purpose for it, is to be a place of assembly, and you can't have a place of assembly without it being handicap accessible and improving the fire safety equipment and mechanical systems, the things that you need to have a safe place for people to gather. And so that, to me, is what the purpose of the improvement is. And so I was making a distinction that I've been trying to research between the idea of having a public access agreement, which says that we're going to require that at some point the public be allowed in this building for one reason or another, versus a use restriction or protection, which says that this building has to remain a nonprofit place of assembly or the money will be returned. And so I'm talking right now about maybe something like that could be structured as a forgivable loan for a period of time rather than a covenant. Or maybe even that is too much meddling in their affairs, and maybe we should leave it at the preservation restriction, because that was ultimately, by improving, for example, 59 Cross Street, if we were to make that building be accessible and then they turn around in 10 years from now and sell it to another organization or business, it's now a historic building that is able to be used. It's been modernized, it's up to code, and it's able to be continually used and evolve to hold whatever purposes the community needs now. And if we didn't put the elevator in it, that would be a building that would be in danger of demolition because it doesn't serve a purpose today. So that's a justification either way for requiring some use agreement or access agreement or not.
So along those lines, with a private individual, if we, sink hundreds of thousands of dollars into the preservation of the building, is it fair or reasonable to ask that upon that building being sold, that it's reimbursed or not, you know?
You could structure it as a forgivable loan so that after a period of time it's forgiven, but if it's sold within a short period of time, that the funds would have to be repaid.
But isn't our goal to get this historical preservation designation so the future owner would also have to preserve it? I mean, they'd be buying it. I don't really know enough
Yeah.
about historical, you know, but wouldn't that transfer with the ownership of the building?
The preservation restriction is in perpetuity,
Yeah, so,
but the forgivable loan idea is just that we're, um, if she were to turn around and sell the house next, a year after we finish the investment, then she would have to repay the funds.
oh, I see.
Just
Because
because she
otherwise
sold
she
the
just
house,
comes out
but it's
400,000.
still,
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of tricky.
it's still protected in perpetuity either way, whether
Yeah,
she
but-
sells the house or doesn't sell it.
But the idea of her essentially having gotten a free grant, which she then capitalized on, you know, when she sells the house. Yeah, I don't know how you do that. I mean,
Well, that's why we have the law department. They know how to do that.
yeah. I mean, certainly, I mean, the affordable housing, you know, when you buy an affordable housing unit, you know, there's restrictions on what you can sell it for, and there's also restrictions, I think, on how soon you can sell it, aren't there?
Often.
Yeah, but
Mhm.
You know,
And
I
it
mean, so
varies.
maybe there's some sort of, you know, parallel like that, which is, and if they sell it prior to that period, they have to, you know, and maybe it's a de-escalating thing, you know, and you know, if they sell it next year, they have to pay back 100% of the loan. If they sell it in 3 years, they have to pay back, you know, 70% of the loan. If they sell it in, you know, 8 years, you know, it's 20% of the loan, or not the loan, you know, the grant. You know, I mean, so maybe we can do that sort of a thing so that, you know, after some number of years, it's theirs.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I guess that's something to, you know, just ruminate on. It would certainly add a whole nother layer of administration and stuff like that. And I guess the hope would, you know, as someone pointed out, I mean, the goal is to preserve and stabilize this building and keep it in good condition. And we would achieve that whether she sold it in a year or in 10 years,
Yeah, that's true.
assuming that the next steward is a steward. You would think they would have to be if they were going to buy a historic building like that.
But I'd feel like a sap, you know, if she sold it next year and made, you know, just, you know, sold it for that, you know, that additional amount that we just put into it.
Mhm.
But yeah, I can't even imagine what the legal construct would be and how hard that would be for us to try and restrict that stuff.
I
Mhm.
think there's
Essentially, I
precedent.
mean, in fact, it kind of, doesn't that make us almost like you know, we'd have like, you know, almost an ownership part of piece of the house. So, you know, they wouldn't even be able to refinance it without that city then getting involved in that. So that
Oh,
is,
God.
that might be real bad.
Yeah.
There's definitely precedent for it, both among other CPA communities structuring their grants this way, as well as the city having housing rehab programs. So we could figure it out if that's what you wanted to
Well, I
apply
mean,
here.
I think at least it's interesting idea to explore. You know, I don't, you know, I don't know how strongly I feel about it, you know, as I sit here right now, but it would be nice to know what our options are. And
Mhm. And so 90 Union Square, which always seems complicated in terms of there's a lot of moving pieces. They do want to use the CPA grant to leverage the US2 sizable contribution. And yet it feels like, you know, it feels like they're really early on still in terms of getting all of the permitting zoning pieces to talk to one another. So it almost feels like that's one of the ones that you could award and then it would go and sit on the shelf for 5 years. Am I right in that suspicion or
Before we
I
go,
don't know
I mean,
about
Roberta,
5 years, but
but you even hinted, didn't you? You kind of hinted at the end of our half an hour ago that the city might be rescinding that.
they're not
Did I
rescinding
understand
it
you right?
exactly. Yeah, I mean, rescinding is a strong word, but they're softening their urgency for it being this year. They would, I think, still, if you didn't fund it this year, they would be right back in line next year for it because I don't think they see it taking 5 years.
Yeah.
But they're now thinking that it might take more than one.
I do kind of, that was my feeling, was that they might be better off coming next year.
Well, I would take that as a minimum.
Yeah.
That was definitely a project I wasn't very enthusiastic about. I feel US2 is, I mean, granted, it's not my job to be making this decision, but I'm being asked to make this decision. And I feel like US2 is making a gazillion dollars off the city already. And it bothers me for us to, be asked to spend our limited resources to sweeten the pot for that. If the city wants to spend its money that way, that's their business. But I don't really like them coming and asking us to spend our money that way.
Okay. So I think we've touched on Grace Baptist, the Somerville Museum, the Adams Magoon, 90 Union. Leaves the Elizabeth Peabody House and Mudflat Studio out there. I saw that in the Mudflat Studio that the Historic Commission had sort of supported it as a
Oh, you went silent again, Heather.
artwork building, and I was wondering during their presentation whether the alterations they had done to the facade were sort of had the historical integrity, but it looked as though the Historic Commission was supporting it. And suggesting perhaps restoring the marquee or doing other things. But I just wanted to kind of bounce that one around with people because it is certainly a building that's been altered. But it has still a lot of character and a lot of the integrity.
So I actually want to, the city, I think, was supportive of it. The commission has actually not taken a position. The Historic Preservation Commission has sometimes taken positions on some of the proposals, but this was staff, not the commission. So I don't know that will affects anybody's thinking, but I just want to make sure that that distinction is being made.
Oh, okay. All right. So has the Historic Commission weighed in on the significance of this building?
So I think we have determined it to be significant.
Yeah.
But the commission has not, as far as I know, weighed in on the Mudflat Studios proposals for funding to do work. I personally think it's a good idea and it's pretty small money, although it's people's initial proposals about evaluations always are small money and they come back looking for bigger money later. So we shouldn't say, oh, it's small money, let's just do it.
Did they get any money from the city or from us when they were restoring the building in the first place? 8-10 years ago, whenever it was.
There was not any CPA funding of any kind in it. If I had to guess, I would guess that there was CDBG money that went into it, but I don't know that. But there was not any CPA funding.
They do
they've
mention
already-
going to other sources for funding the construction of the recommendations, that they were asking CPA funds to do the study, and then they would find other grant money to do the work. So, okay. So, I personally am fading. Does anyone have any sort of last thoughts or concerns that they want to share with the group?
No, but this was helpful. I kind of appreciated this, this discussion. I'm looking forward to us having kind of similarly candid discussions, next month.
Yeah.
Let me share a thought which is quite inconclusive about the city projects generally, which is that when we are looking at private nonprofits, we are appropriately, among other things, saying, where else have you gone to for money? Are you just coming to us, or are you doing money elsewhere, looking for a match on? When we're talking about city projects, a possible place always is the city to simply fund it rather than using CPA funds. So, at one extreme, we could say we're not going to put any money into any of these projects because the city can simply fund it itself. You can go to city council and say, this is a really important project. We have a park grant, for example. We need a match. We don't have the money from CPA, and so we want you to do it. And when we asked last month in the proposals, that's essentially what we're told is, we don't know where we would get the money, but we would certainly go to city council on it. I'm not saying that to advocate, therefore we shouldn't fund those city proposals. But it's just one consideration. Another consideration is the city usually is really very good, particularly the Parks Department, about looking for other money. And they come to us and they say, we've got a park, we applied to the state, we've got a park grant, we need a local match on it, we want to use CPA funds. So we've done typically exactly what we're asking for, which is to
Right.
money someplace else, and then come to us if there's a shortfall after that other money. And so those two thoughts that I just gave pull in opposite directions, and I wasn't putting them out to try and go in one direction or the other, but just to note those things, and they are, in a sense, sort of qualitatively different, say, from some of the nonprofits, which we would like to see be doing more outside funding than they have, but often don't have a lot of other places to go to other than us.
Yeah. But that actually brings up exactly that sort of Henry Hansen Park. I'm not exactly familiar with it, but I gather it's a really small parcel, and it doesn't seem like the city's plans are all that ambitious. But they're asking for $350,000 from us, which seemed like a lot of money. And then going to Dick's point, they also kind of said, hey, and we've also got $375,000 in park money. And I was like, that's a huge amount of money. And I just don't really understand how they possibly need that much money for this project. And I don't know where again, I'm still feel kind of green in this role about what our role is in order to just be like just general, fiduciary obligation of, is this money being well spent? Is that a reasonable amount of money for the scale project that they're doing? And I don't have I don't have expertise in that. It's just, that's an awful lot of money for a little pocket park.
I felt that way about the 100,000 for the design study at 217 Somerville Ave, not including surveys and stuff like that. Yeah. I guess that's a good question. I've sort of wondered about that too, and it's a hard one to wade into. But flipping it to 217 Somerville Ave, I sort of feel like could apply some pressure to say, get the Brown School done. with the design monies that we gave you for that, and then ask us for design monies for 217 Somerville Ave. You know, like, trying to kind of push some of these things along. I know things get bottlenecked, but I guess they tried to address the Brown School in an earlier presentation to us about why it was delayed, but perhaps we have to hear it again.
Actually, the Brown School the design is nearly completed, and that is expected to go out to bid this winter. It's the Kennedy School that they've been bidding on.
Kennedy, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
But right, yeah, I mean, if the answer is that's just what this stuff, it costs $100,000 to do a plan. It's like, it seems like a lot of money.
Seems like a lot of money to me too. At some level, I think we may just have to sort of accept it on faith that this really is what these things cost, and the city does a lot of them, and they do a really nice job.
And a lot of community process and
I don't know.
But I do have a somewhat similar reaction to say, here's a pocket park. Why does it take $750,000 by the time you get to a pocket park?
And to Dick's point about the applications and just the presentation of the applications from the city versus the smaller nonprofits, and again, when I did when I filled out the matrix, I noticed myself giving the higher percentage, or the higher scores rather, to the city-backed applications. And there's a part of my brain that's going, well, we don't, as the CPC, we don't want to give the appearance that we're just like a slush fund for the city to tap into. And so if we gave all our money to the city applicants, the city applications, that could be the perception. And that's just something that I have in my head as I'm going through that and catching the numbers. Again, that's why I don't quite trust those scores that I came up with in a way. And it's something, I think it was Dick who said it earlier, like the threes don't necessarily count equally for each category, which is why it's important that I'm so glad we're having this discussion right now, because here is where the nitty gritty is coming up a little bit and we can just talk about it. Whereas when I come up with my number, I know I'm not, it's just not as full an evaluation, basically.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, and the city has, a whole department that's working on these applications, and these other guys are, running a childcare center and trying to keep their building from falling in.
Right. They're lucky if they can hire a grant writing consultant to do it freelance. They're struggling. Yeah.
So right. So it's not a level, I don't think it's reasonable for us to expect a level playing field with regard to the professionalness of the proposal. I think we have to look beyond that as to what the larger objective is.
But isn't it one of our missions to fund level playing fields? That counts as open space.
That's an open space. No, that would probably be a recreation if we for differentiated.
I think the level playing field is Dillboy, which is still waiting to be completed. So.
It's in the queue.
It's in the queue, right, for years. That's right.
Dillboy's all done. Dillboy's all done. Although the high school field now,
The artificial turf field is all done, but
not the
CPA
auxiliary.
funded the auxiliary fields, which have been waiting to be completed.
Oh yeah, okay. Were they on? I don't remember seeing them on your list.
I think they're on the list on the current projects.
Okay.
I didn't highlight them as stalled because I think they actually are ongoing, but just on a very slow process.
They kind of are stalled because they were very clear to the Conservation Commission that they were doing, the artificial turf field first, and they were going to do the auxiliary field some other time. I didn't get the feeling there was a time frame for it.
Yep.
All right, so everyone will come up with a little scenario, and we will continue this discussion. It's a great round of candidates and applications all around. So we're very fortunate. I feel like our outreach perhaps is paid off, and that we have a nice variety of people coming. So, hooray!
All right.
And Chuck, I want to go back to our earlier conversation just to make sure that I have this straight. So we've decided we're going to go into January
for selection of projects. I think so.
For this year, and we'll
So-
try to work the calendar for next year so that that doesn't happen again.
So, and to Dick's point, by going into next year, that means that I think we'll have one new person replacing Tatiana next year. And so that person will have to catch up like on all the meetings, like watch all the recordings of the meetings leading up to this so that they'll have an understanding of what the projects are. So they'll have to do some extra research to be able to jump into this.
Well, it's possible that what we might be doing in January is reviewing the recommendations, that we may have already developed our budget, but we're reviewing the conditions that go along with the award.
Yeah. And David, what were you saying about your term?
My term might end sometime in the spring as well, actually. Because I took over in the middle of my predecessor's term.
Right. I didn't flag your term as ending, but I'll take another look at it and get
I
back
don't
to you.
really know when it started, but I was told anecdotally, that she was a year and a half in when I took over.
Yeah. If you wanted to hold on for 1 minute after we close the meeting, I can give you an
I
answer.
don't need to know right now. I just wanted to, while you were just talking about it, I just wanted to bring it up. It's not something I'm going to do anything about in the next, half hour.
Okay.
Okay. Can I have a motion to adjourn?
I will.
You got three.
I'll second.
Choose one. I'll second the motion to adjourn.
All right. Jahan,
Yes.
Dick,
Yes.
Laura,
Yep.
David,
Yes.
hi, Heather.
Yes.
All right. Meeting is adjourned.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.